I had a lot of doubts because of how much, she even told her, oh my gosh, your dad, he was great, he's my idol, and blah, blah, blah. And I just felt like, wow.
For more than 4 decades, Priscilla Presley has carried a weight most of us cannot begin to imagine. She has been the keeper of a legacy so vast and so consuming that it has its own zip code, its own annual pilgrimage, its own mythology that grows wilder and more unmanageable with every passing year. She has stood at the gates of Graceland and smiled for cameras. She has given interviews about the man she married when she was barely more than a girl. She has raised their daughter in the shadow of a father who belonged more to the world than he ever belonged to them. And through all of it, through every rumor and every conspiracy and every bizarre claim that has circulated about Elvis Presley since the day he died, Priscilla has done something extraordinary. She has stayed quiet, not silent, but selective, not dismissive, but dignified. She has learned over the years which questions deserve answers and which ones feed something that can never be satisfied. She has watched people claim Elvis faked his death, that he's living in seclusion, that he's been spotted in gas stations and grocery stores from Michigan to Argentina. She has seen the theories multiply and mutate, each one stranger than the last, each one carrying with it a kind of desperate hope that refuses to accept what the official record has stated plainly since August of 1977. And she has let them pass. She has let the noise be noise. Because engaging with it, she understood, would only make it louder. But then, something shifted. In recent months, Priscilla Presley did something she has almost never done before. She addressed, directly and on the record, the single most persistent and most emotionally charged conspiracy theory in the entire Elvis canon, the Bob Joyce theory. And what she said didn't shut it down, it didn't laugh it off, it didn't do any of the things people expected. What she said instead was so carefully chosen, so loaded with subtext, and so completely unexpected that it has left both believers and skeptics sitting in a kind of stunned silence, trying to figure out what exactly just happened. This isn't a woman who speaks carelessly. Priscilla Presley has spent decades learning how to protect Elvis's image, how to manage his estate, how to navigate the impossible line between honoring the man she loved and feeding the machine that turned him into an industry. She knows what happens when you give the wrong answer to the wrong question at the wrong time. She knows that every word she says about Elvis will be dissected, analyzed, quoted out of context, and used to support whatever narrative someone has already decided to believe. And still, when the Bob Joyce question came up, she didn't dodge it. She didn't deflect. She answered. And her answer has sent shockwaves through a community of people who have spent years, in some cases decades, studying this question with a seriousness that would surprise anyone who hasn't been paying attention. Because here's what you need to understand before we go any further. The Bob Joyce theory is not fringe anymore. It hasn't been for years. Millions of people across the world have listened to side-by-side audio comparisons of Elvis Presley and Bob Joyce, a pastor at a small church in Arkansas who has never claimed to be anyone other than exactly who he says he is. And those millions of people have heard something they cannot unhear. A voice so eerily, so impossibly identical to Elvis that even trained musicians and audio professionals have struggled to identify differences. Not similarities. Differences. The kind of vocal match that doesn't happen by accident, that doesn't happen through imitation, and that has never been adequately explained by anyone with the credentials to explain it definitively. Bob Joyce himself has never encouraged the speculation. He has never marketed himself as Elvis. He has never sold tickets or merchandise or capitalized in any visible way on the resemblance that has made him one of the most talked about figures in the Elvis community. He simply preaches. He sings gospel music in the same tradition Elvis grew up in. And every Sunday, people drive from across the country to sit in his congregation and experience something they describe as overwhelming, inexplicable, and deeply spiritual. These are not tabloid readers looking for a thrill. These are lifelong Elvis fans, people who know his voice better than they know their own, people who have listened to every recording, every bootleg, every scrap of audio that exists, and they are telling you with absolute conviction that what they are hearing in that Arkansas church is not an impersonator. It is him. So when Priscilla Presley, the woman who slept beside him, who bore his child, who watched him unravel under the pressure of being Elvis Presley, was finally asked point blank what she thinks about Bob Joyce, the world held its breath. And what she said wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It wasn't a dismissal or a confirmation or anything that fit neatly into the categories people had prepared for. What she said was something far more unsettling. Something that suggests she has thought about this more than anyone realized. Something that makes you wonder, even if you've never believed a conspiracy theory in your life, whether the woman who knew Elvis best might know something the rest of us are still trying to figure out. Because here's what no one saw coming. Her answer wasn't about Bob Joyce at all. It was about Elvis. And what he wanted. And what he never got. And whether the man the world turned into a king ever had the chance to just be a man. And that changes everything. What Priscilla Presley said, when the question was finally put to her directly, was not what anyone had scripted in their minds. She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't offer the kind of polite dismissal that public figures use when they want to move on from something beneath their dignity. Instead, she paused, and in that pause, you could feel the weight of 40 years sitting on her shoulders. 40 years of being asked to defend a dead man's reputation. 40 years of being the keeper of a story that the world refuses to let end. And then she spoke, and what came out was something so unexpectedly vulnerable, so layered with grief and understanding and a kind of weary compassion, that it stopped people cold. She said, and these words matter more than almost anything else in this entire conversation, that she understands why people want to believe Elvis is still alive. She said it without condescension, without judgment. She said it like a woman who has spent decades watching the world refuse to let go of a man she had to let go of a long time ago. She acknowledged that the love people have for Elvis, the need they feel to keep him present, to keep him real, to keep him somehow accessible even now, is not foolishness. It is not delusion. It is love. And love, she said, does not always follow logic. It follows need. And the need people have to believe that Elvis Presley did not die alone and broken and over-medicated in a bathroom at 42 years old is a need she recognizes because she has felt versions of it herself. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. But here's where it gets complicated. Here is where Priscilla's answer moves from empathy into something far more unsettling. Because she did not stop there. She did not simply say, I understand why you feel this way, but he's gone, and you need to accept that. She didn't close the door. She left it open. Not wide open, but open enough that the light coming through it has left people on both sides of this debate uncertain about what they just heard. She talked about Elvis's deep and abiding desire for privacy. She talked about how suffocated he felt by fame, how trapped he was inside a life that gave him everything except the one thing he wanted most, which was to be left alone. To be ordinary. To walk into a room without every person in it needing something from him. And then, in a moment that has been replayed and analyzed and quoted in every corner of the Elvis internet, she said something that felt almost like permission. She said that if Elvis had found a way to step out of the spotlight, to live quietly, to return to the music and the faith that mattered to him most without the circus that came with being Elvis Presley, she would not blame him. She would understand. She did not say he did it. But she did not say he didn't. And the space between those two things is where millions of people are now living, trying to figure out what she meant and what she didn't mean. And whether the woman who knew him best just told us, in the most careful language imaginable, that she has made peace with a possibility the rest of the world still calls impossible. What makes this so shocking is not just what Priscilla said. It is who she is. This is not a woman given to wild speculation. This is not someone who profits from keeping conspiracies alive. Priscilla Presley runs Graceland. She has spent her entire adult life managing Elvis's estate, protecting his image, and making sure that his legacy is treated with the respect and dignity it deserves. She has every reason in the world to shut down theories that suggest Elvis faked his death. Every financial reason, every reputational reason, every personal reason. And yet, when given the opportunity to do exactly that, she chose a different path. She chose nuance. She chose empathy. And she chose words that left room for doubt. That choice matters, because Priscilla did not have to say any of this. She could have dismissed the Bob Joyce theory with a single sentence and moved on. She could have said, "I was there when he died, I identified his body, this is offensive to his memory, and we will not dignify it with a response." That would have been the easy answer. The expected answer. The answer that protects Graceland and the estate and the carefully curated version of Elvis that millions of people pay to visit every single year. But she didn't say that. And the fact that she didn't say that is, for a lot of people, more telling than anything she did say. Because here's what Priscilla knows that the rest of us can only guess at. She knows what Elvis sounded like when he was alone. She knows what he talked about in the hours when the cameras were off and the handlers were gone and it was just the two of them in the quiet. She knows what he was afraid of. She knows what he dreamed about. And she knows, better than anyone alive, whether the man who died in 1977 was a man who had made peace with his life or a man who was still searching desperately for a way out. So when she speaks about the possibility, however remote, however unlikely, that Elvis might have wanted to disappear, she is not speaking theoretically. She is speaking from memory, from intimate knowledge, from a place of understanding that no historian, no biographer, no fan, no matter how devoted, will ever be able to access. And that is what makes her answer so unsettling. Because if Priscilla Presley, of all people, is willing to leave the door open even a crack, then maybe the people who have been standing outside that door for 40 years are not as crazy as the world has told them they are. There is a reason this theory has survived for decades, while 1,000 other Elvis conspiracy theories have flickered out and disappeared into the background noise of the internet. And the reason is not hope. It is not sentimentality. It is not the refusal of grieving fans to accept that their hero is gone. The reason this theory persists is evidence. Not proof, but evidence. The kind of evidence that sits in front of you and refuses to be easily dismissed no matter how much you want it to go away. And at the center of all of it, standing quietly in a small church in Arkansas with no security and no fanfare and no acknowledgement of the storm swirling around his name, is a man named Bob Joyce. Bob Joyce does not look like Elvis Presley. That is the first thing people notice when they see him for the first time. There is no jumpsuit, no sideburns, no theatrical presence. He is an older man now, graying, soft-spoken, dressed in the unremarkable clothes of a rural pastor who has spent his life serving a congregation that would fit comfortably inside a high school gymnasium. He does not move like Elvis. He does not carry himself like someone who was once the most famous man on the planet. And if you walked past him on the street, you would not give him a second glance. But then he opens his mouth, and the entire room changes. The voice is not similar to Elvis Presley. It is identical. Not in the way a talented impersonator can mimic the sound, but in the way that every single vocal signature, every vibrato, every tonal quality, every subtle inflection that made Elvis's voice unmistakable is present in Bob Joyce's voice without any apparent effort. Audio engineers have run spectral analysis comparing isolated vocal tracks from Elvis recordings to recordings of Bob Joyce preaching and singing in his church. And what they have found is not resemblance. It is overlap. The kind of overlap that does not happen between two different human beings. The kind of overlap that suggests, at a level deeper than subjective opinion, that these voices are coming from the same instrument. Now, the immediate counter-argument is that Bob Joyce must be an impersonator, that he has spent years studying Elvis's voice and has trained himself to replicate it so precisely that even technology cannot tell the difference. But that explanation falls apart the moment you spend any time actually watching Bob Joyce. Because he is not performing. There is no affect, no attempt to sound like anyone other than himself. He preaches with the plain, unadorned sincerity of a man who has been doing this work for 40 years and has never needed an audience beyond the people sitting in the pews in front of him. He is not trying to sound like Elvis. He just does. Effortlessly, consistently, every single Sunday. And he has never once, in all the years this theory has followed him, capitalized on it. That detail is crucial. Bob Joyce has never sold autographs. He has never charged admission to his church. He has never appeared on television to promote himself or released an album marketed to Elvis fans or done anything that would suggest he is aware of or interested in the financial windfall that being Elvis Presley, even in secret, would provide. He has lived a modest, faithful, utterly unremarkable life. And the only people who know his name are the ones who have gone looking for him. He did not come looking for them. He has never encouraged the speculation, and when asked directly about the theory, he has responded with the same quiet consistency. He is not Elvis. He is a man called to preach the gospel, and that is all he has ever wanted to be. And yet, the people who sit in his church, many of whom have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles to be there, will tell you without hesitation that something happens in that room that they cannot explain. These are not casual fans. These are people who have spent their entire lives listening to Elvis Presley. People who know his voice the way you know the voice of someone you love. People who can tell the difference between a 1956 recording and a 1968 recording by the texture of his tone alone. And they are telling you that when Bob Joyce sings, they are not hearing an imitation. They are hearing him. The same spirit, the same soul, the same unmistakable presence that made Elvis Presley who he was. This is where Priscilla's words take on a new and deeper significance. Because if you accept, even hypothetically, that Elvis wanted out, that he was drowning under the weight of being Elvis Presley, and that the only escape he could imagine was disappearing entirely, then Bob Joyce's life makes perfect sense. It is not the life of someone pretending to be Elvis. It is the life of someone who used to be Elvis and chose something quieter, something humbler, something that allowed him to return to the one thing that ever made him feel whole, which was singing for God in a room full of people who did not need him to be anything other than faithful. The timeline supports it. Bob Joyce's documented presence in Arkansas begins almost exactly when Elvis Presley's documented life ends. The geography supports it. Arkansas is close enough to Memphis to feel familiar, but far enough to disappear. The psychology supports it. A man suffocated by fame returning to the only tradition that ever made him feel free. And now, after decades of silence, Priscilla Presley has said, in her own carefully chosen words, that she would understand if he had done exactly that. Not that he did, but that she would understand. And for the people who have believed this for years, who have been mocked and dismissed and told they are living in fantasy, that acknowledgement from the one person who knew him best feels like vindication, not proof, but permission to keep believing that maybe, just maybe, the king never really left the building. He just found a smaller one. And maybe that is the part of this story that people are really afraid to say out loud. Maybe the reason Priscilla's response hit so hard is not because it proved anything. It didn't. It was not a confession. It was not a coded message. It was not the final missing piece that suddenly makes every mystery collapse into certainty. But it did something almost more powerful than proof. It reminded people that behind every theory, behind every grainy comparison video, behind every whispered claim about Bob Joyce and Arkansas and the voice that refuses to sound like anyone but Elvis, there is a wound that never fully healed. Because Elvis Presley did not just die in 1977. Something larger happened. A generation lost the man they believed belonged to them. His family lost someone they could never grieve privately. And the world lost a figure so enormous, so emotionally loaded, that ordinary death felt too small to contain him. That is why the questions began almost immediately. Not because people were foolish, not because they wanted to disrespect his memory, but because the official ending never felt big enough for the life that came before it. The king of rock and roll, gone at 42, found alone, broken by pressure, medication, isolation, and the machinery of fame. For people who loved him, that ending felt unbearable. So they began to imagine another one. And that is where Priscilla becomes so important. Because she stands in a place none of the rest of us can stand. She is not simply a witness to Elvis's life. She is one of the last living bridges between Elvis Presley the myth and Elvis Presley the man. She knew him before the image fully hardened around him. She knew the private voice, the private fear, the private exhaustion. She saw the cost of the crown when the cameras were not rolling. And for decades, she has had to listen while strangers debated whether the man she loved really died, really escaped, really transformed himself into someone else. Imagine the cruelty of that. Imagine being asked over and over again to either defend the death of someone you lost or leave space for a fantasy that keeps him alive for everyone except you. That is why her answer matters so much. Not because it gives the internet permission to declare victory, but because it reveals the emotional truth underneath the question. Priscilla understands something that many skeptics refuse to acknowledge. The Bob Joyce theory is not only about Bob Joyce, it is about Elvis wanting peace. It is about Elvis escaping the cage. It is about the possibility that the man who gave his entire life to the public might have found one final way to take something back for himself. That is the fantasy at the center of it. And it is a powerful one, because in some painful way, it feels like justice. But justice and truth are not always the same thing. That is the difficult line this story forces us to walk. Wanting Elvis to have survived does not mean he did. Hearing a voice that shakes you to your core does not automatically overturn death certificates, family testimony, medical records, and decades of documented history. And yet, dismissing everyone who hears that voice as delusional also misses something essential. People are not only reacting to sound, they are reacting to longing. They are reacting to the feeling that Elvis Presley, in the deepest part of himself, was never meant to be trapped inside the role the world built for him. That is what makes the Bob Joyce theory different from so many other celebrity conspiracies. It does not imagine Elvis hiding on an island, laughing at the world, surrounded by wealth and secrecy. It imagines him in a church. It imagines him singing gospel. It imagines him choosing humility over spectacle, worship over applause, a congregation over an audience. And whether that is true or not, it tells us something profound about what people believe Elvis really wanted. Not more fame, not more screaming crowds, not more gold records. Peace, redemption, a quiet room. A song that did not have to sell anything. And maybe Priscilla knows that better than anyone. Maybe that is why she did not treat the question like a joke. Because even if Elvis did not become Bob Joyce, the emotional shape of the theory touches something real about him. He did want escape. He did love gospel music. He did crave spiritual comfort. He did struggle under the impossible pressure of being turned into a living monument. And in that sense, the theory survives because it is built around a truth, even if the conclusion remains unproven. It gives Elvis the ending many people wish he had been allowed to have. Still, we cannot forget what this has cost the people who were actually left behind. For fans, mystery can feel romantic. For family, it can feel like a second grief that never ends. Every new theory forces Priscilla and everyone connected to Elvis back into the same impossible position. They must either correct the world again or stay silent and watch silence become evidence. That is a heavy burden. And it is one Priscilla has carried with more dignity than most people would have managed. She has protected the legacy, preserved the home, defended the man, and survived the myth. So what are we supposed to do with her response? Maybe we stop trying to make it smaller than it is? Maybe we stop demanding that it be either a confirmation or a denial? Maybe the real shock is that Priscilla Presley, after all these years, seemed to understand the believers without fully joining them. She seemed to acknowledge the ache behind the question. She seemed to recognize that people are not just asking whether Elvis is alive, they are asking whether he ever found peace. And that is the question that lingers. Not in a courtroom way. Not in a scientific way. In a human way. Did Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who sang gospel like prayer, ever get free from the machinery that devoured him? Did he leave this world trapped inside the legend? Or did some part of him escape into the music, into the faith, into the voices that still carry him forward? Maybe that is why this story refuses to die. Because Elvis himself became something bigger than evidence. He became grief. He became hope. He became the sound of a world refusing to say goodbye. And maybe Priscilla's answer was never meant to close the case. Maybe it was meant to remind us that some questions are more sacred than their answers. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. There are truths about Elvis Presley, Priscilla, and the people who love them that most fans will never hear. Subscribe, and it is one Priscilla has carried with more dignity than most people would have managed. She has protected the legacy, preserved the home, defended the man, and survived the myth. So what are we supposed to do with her response? Maybe we stop trying to make it smaller than it is? Maybe we stop demanding that it be either a confirmation or a denial? Maybe the real shock is that Priscilla Presley, after all these years, seemed to understand the believers without fully joining them. She seemed to acknowledge the ache behind the question. She seemed to recognize that people are not just asking whether Elvis is alive, they are asking whether he ever found peace. And that is the question that lingers. Not in a courtroom way. Not in a scientific way. In a human way. Did Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who sang gospel like prayer, ever get free from the machinery that devoured him? Did he leave this world trapped inside the legend? Or did some part of him escape into the music, into the faith, into the voices that still carry him forward? Maybe that is why this story refuses to die. Because Elvis himself became something bigger than evidence. He became grief. He became hope. He became the sound of a world refusing to say goodbye. And maybe Priscilla's answer was never meant to close the case. Maybe it was meant to remind us that some questions are more sacred than their answers. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. There are truths about Elvis Presley, Priscilla, and the people who love them that most fans will never hear. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who still believes in the King.